Welcome to this discussion on payment fraud. I'm Elliot Berman from AML RightSource, and I'm here with my colleagues Nikki Siko, Adrianna Wolfe, and Pat Haney. Payment fraud is a global problem that continues to grow. It directly impacts both financial service providers and their customers. In 2024, nearly 1 in 3 U.S. financial institutions reported over $1 million in direct fraud losses, and that was up from 25% in 2023. This is the first of a series of conversations on payment fraud. Today, we're going to provide an overview of the current state of payment fraud and what many forms of payment fraud have in common, and then we're going to look at the types of payment fraud and how they can be identified through monitoring and investigations. So, Pat, let's start with you. Incidents of payment fraud are growing, as I mentioned. What are some of the topologies that you're seeing in this space?
Yeah, in our experience, we're seeing a lot of wire fraud, push payment fraud, ACH fraud. And what's interesting is check payment fraud is one of the biggest ones that's on the rise. And if you think about it, the check usage in the United States and globally is going way down. Yet check fraud is on the rise. And if you think about it, it's significantly decreased over the years because it's outdated, particularly with the popularity and speed of digital payments, wires, ACH transactions. Yet check fraud continues to be on the rise because of the many different ways that you can do it. It could be as simple, as someone putting a 1 in front of a $1,000 check, making it 10,000 and altering the amount, or it can be very sophisticated where they're check cooking and using computerized software, high quality paper to actually make real legitimate checks. So it's very interesting to see. And I know my colleagues, Nikki and Adrianna, are seeing a lot of that in their clients.
Nikki, tell us what else you're seeing in the check fraud space.
We're seeing a lot of remote deposit fraud from, which ties into elder abuse fraud. We're seeing a lot of family members taking checks and just remote depositing them via, grandma or grandpa's cell phones and getting, full bank accounts moved quickly and not being able to truly, stop that. The other thing that we are seeing is a lot of check fraud within medical offices. That's on an increase. Medical staffing, just getting a client's co-payment in a check and then copying the check and photographing it and taking it and, creating your own checks and writing them. And it's so sophisticated now to where you can just take a picture of a check, change the dollar amount with, the editing in your cell phone and then printing it out and then doing remote deposit. So you don't know what the actual paper part of that check is. It's just an image on top of an image. So we're seeing an increase there as well.
Adrianna, seeing anything else?
Yeah, so it's funny because, on a daily basis, physical checks are visibly obsolete. But as we've noted, check payment fraud is virtually on the rise. And as Pat had noted, there's different types of that check payment. So you can go from altered to forged, to counterfeit checks. Mail theft is really big. Within the past 2 years, we've seen an increase of that, especially over the COVID times and just coming out of COVID times it was very rampant where we would see mail theft, and that would be the majority of the check payment fraud that we are seeing.
Go ahead.
So to pick up what Adrianna is doing is back, 5 or 6 years ago, pre-COVID, check fraud was really just paper checks being deposited in people's accounts. We're seeing so much with technology enhancing that what would be considered a check payment fraud, where you can do like an ACH from your bank account that's presented as like a check. and submitted through. We're seeing multiple types, and that's the part of the check fraud that's really increasing versus just, someone making a check or stealing a check, changing the name or washing it, and then going into their local bank and depositing it. There's so many different options of how to process a check right now or present a check. It is what's really hindering the ability to, be proactive with that fraud piece.
Yeah, and I was just going to say on top of that, you see on the news, nationally, locally, the law enforcement is arresting and convicting actual fraud rings that are stealing checks right out of the mail. Sometimes even postal workers are involved, which is wild because individually, on a personal basis, a lot of individuals don't necessarily use checks, but businesses still do business to business payments. I would say it's 30% range still use it, even though checks are a little bit outdated. So you're seeing that as well.
So let's talk about other kinds of payment fraud beyond check fraud. What else are you seeing, Adrianna?
Yes. So we are seeing a lot of ACH fraud. So, that's unauthorized transfers, either credit or debit transactions. So we're seeing a lot where, you'll get a fake invoice or, you're getting a text message of, hey, can you click this link? And you're making what looks like a legitimate payment, but the bank details on the other end are actually to a fraudster. Push payment. So that's a social engineered attack. Again, authorized payments through impersonation. So I'm sure you've heard of those text messages where you have an unpaid toll booth fee, or, hi, mom, I got in some trouble. I need some bail. And you're clicking on those links and you're essentially giving all of your information to these fraudsters. And it makes it easier for them to access your accounts and send those transactions to themselves or, who knows where. So those ACH and push payments are, in my experience, what I've seen a lot of during transaction monitoring.
And with the push payments and the social engineering AI software, it's getting to be the voices sound similar. The information that they have is very accurate, so it's very believable. So the fraudsters are really able to penetrate those markets and individuals. And you think you're just clicking on a link. Maybe it's something small too, of sending like 15, 20, $50, but that adds up if they're doing it over, a huge population.
Nikki, other types of payment fraud?
The wire fraud is on an uptick as well. People sending money wires to unknown entities in overseas. We're seeing a lot of once again, elderly individuals not experienced with that, falling back into those romance scams, or the scams are like, hey, we arrested your grandson, we're keeping him, he needs bail. Those kind of frauds, they're reappearing heavily again. Now that, post-COVID is really, the world's back into full swing. So we're seeing a lot of just not being educated on why or what to send a fraud. And we're talking about like a lot of MoneyGram wires or Western Union type wires. Not so much as a wire from a bank account to another bank account. We're seeing them really an uptick in, well, this person's pulled this money out and sent a wire here. The other thing we're also seeing an uptick is in wire fraud is not doing it at your bank, right? Particularly those fraudsters are telling them, take the money out and go somewhere else and do the wire. Don't do the wire through your bank, because that's one of the first defenses with banks is, this doesn't seem right. Let's ask some questions, know what we're doing on our end to prevent you from, being a victim. And they're just taking those communications next level. That's really enhancing that fraud piece. That's not helping with what we're putting in place to combat the fraud and fraud prevention.
Yeah, and I even have a personal experience with that. Is my grandma was almost a victim of that. So somebody called her pretending to be me, actually saying that I was arrested in Mexico and needed $1,500 to get out of jail, like a bail or something like that. And he had a lot of personal information about me somehow. And my grandma luckily called my dad and said, is Patrick okay? Is Pat okay? I got this phone call, and my dad's like, I just talked to him. He just left my house. He's fine. He's not in Mexico. My dad immediately called me. He's like, call your grandmother with her right now. And, luckily she didn't send any of the money, but she came, I'd say 80% close to sending that Western Union wire.
So lots of different formats, lots of different platforms too. ACH, which has been around for a really long time. Wire, of course, which has been around. There are other platform check, as you talked about. And then there are some of the newer person-to-person platforms. What are a handful of the common elements you're seeing in these frauds? So, Pat, let's start with you.
One key common element is, first off, establishing whether the account holder is the victim or is the fraud actually being conducted by the account holder. So at that point, you can determine if it's an account owner fraud, AOF, a true name fraud, TNF, or account takeover. And every bank's tolerance is different as to who's the victim or the suspect and where that threshold begins or ends. And I know Adrianna has some good insight on that, and Nikki as well.
Right. To add to that, with the different thresholds, it comes down to whether that bank is, like Pat said, identifying that individual as a suspect or a victim. It might come down to whether the individual attempted the transaction, whether the customer self-reported the activity, just different. In my experience, it's different bank to bank on where that line is drawn on, oh, I am going to identify this individual as a suspect, even though they already sent the money, but then afterwards told me, I think I made a mistake. So it's definitely varying bank to bank on where that threshold is on whether that account holder is a victim or a suspect.
Nikki, anything to add?
No, I'm seeing in my experience the same trends that Pat and Adrianna spoke to.
So now let's shift and talk about how these types of frauds might show up in the monitoring process. Nikki, let's start with you.
It's really hard to identify fraud in the monitoring. In my experience, we're seeing a lot of banks moving to a hybrid kind of monitoring partnership between the fraud department and the VSA department to help increase that monitoring out of the normal patterns, right? KYC, the basics is really where we hone in. Does this make sense for this individual? For example, this individual, is buying all this information from Amazon, but that's the only purchases in her account that looks like there are online purchases. Does that make sense for her patterns? Just the basic AML 101 knowledge and really getting to know your customer is how we are identifying it. Things out of the norm, expected activity plays a key part in that as well. A lot of the fraud cases are really based on referrals or interactions in the branch that get escalated to the BSA departments. There's a lot of model validations in the alert process that they are putting in to really hone in on that piece that triggers. Lots of times if we do identify anything fraud in the alert or case process, it's a ring that we've identified and uncovered, and we were able to connect the dots and follow the funds. So right now, there's just, nothing outside the normal, just kind of really the basics of BSA that really help us identify fraud in the monitoring stage.
Well, I do think patterns is a big one because a lot of the financial institutions and banks are really using a lot of AI and machine learning software to kind of detect those anomalies. And, a good portion too is especially with fraud is customer identified fraud. You're calling in and saying, hey, I didn't conduct these transactions. And they're seeing a lot of financial institutions from our experience, the login attempts, if they're seeing multiple login attempts, the multi-authenticator. One thing's interesting too, a lot of financial institutions have actual fraud mining software. One good example is the customer phone calls are being recorded, and what they have is voice recognition software, so they know what the actual customer sounds like, and then they will run that against the actual customer calls. And so you're seeing a lot of alerts being generated, because what happens is the fraudster will call in and say, hey, I lost access to my account. Can you reset it? And then they give them a different phone number. And if you listen to some of the calls, they're almost comical sometimes, because they come up with these excuses. Well, you can't email that one that's on file because my girlfriend did this and that, and here's a new one that you can send the authentication to. And so alerts are generated that way. But customers, when it comes to fraud, you're monitoring your accounts pretty regularly, at least you should be. And if you see those transactions, and sometimes it's a good time. If you've been on vacation, you might get an alert from your bank. Hey, see, you're not in your location. I live in Cleveland, so if I'm in Florida or something like that, and they don't see a plane ticket on there, you might get some notifications, and that's good.
Right. In my experience as well, obviously you will see your internal detection where it is caught by those different systems that are put in place, but customer identification is probably the most prevalent way that we are finding out about these fraud transactions, especially with wire transactions. Customers nowadays are reviewing their bank statements and their online accounts more often. They have, like Pat said, notifications set up where you're getting text messages after every transaction that's made saying, hey, this is, whatever your bank is, was this you that made this $100 transaction, or whatever the amount may be. So I think customer identification is really important. And like Pat said, if you're not already, you should be monitoring your bank activity. It is easy to just log on these days and check and see what activity occurred throughout that day or that week, or however often that you are checking that.
And it's in the interest of, go ahead, Nikki.
Go ahead, Pat.
I would say it's in the interest of the financials and the banks to get ahead of this, especially with the negative implications. If it hits the news, a big fraud occurred at their institution, and that negative media goes a long way. So banks want to get ahead of this and prevent it.
In addition to that, we've seen on the customer identified fraud, more education being provided by the banks of, if you see this transaction, don't do this. So my son is 17. We went and opened up a checking account so he can learn the financial piece of this. And we went to our bank, and the individual who was helping us open that account really sat down and educated him on, these are the things that might happen. Don't do this. Don't push on links. If we're going to contact you, you're going to know we're going to contact you. So I think why we're seeing an increase in the fraud piece with the customer informing the bank that I'm being, have fraud transactions, is because the bank is taking a broader approach across the board, educating their clientele to, this is the kind of scheme we have. I know I get a monthly newsletter with my statement that says, these are the fraud patterns that we're identifying. Any questions, feel free to call the branch. I think they're really trying to be more proactive, because it is hard to identify fraud in the monitoring and BSA world, and where we really rely on, their front lines identifying something's not right, or the customer calling in and saying, hey, I have this unusual transaction. They're trying to be more proactive, and it's really working. I know that there's a lot of, my experience, a lot of my clients are doing more of that financial literacy, things within community centers and within the schools to really put what they're seeing and to prevent the impact of fraud, getting ahead of it. But as they're identifying, or as we're identifying different trends of different types of payments, once circling back, the old style fraud is on the rise, because not that it's out of sight, but it's back of mind, right? Like who writes a check? Checks are down. What do you mean check fraud is higher, right? And the fraudsters are picking up on that, and they're back to doing basic fraud that we used to be like, oh, we caught this fraud, or this is this fraud, and we would be excited because we were able to identify it, which was, normal basic fraud. And they're going back to doing old school things to get things through, because as the complexity or technology increases, the whereabouts of that fraud or that knowledge is also increasing as well. So it really feels like lately, within the last year and a half, fraud has really taken a step back, and it's just been basic transactions that we would normally have identified 10 years ago as a fraudster type of act.
Right.
And
I've
Elliot,
even seen, oh, I'm so sorry. I was going to say, just being proactive. If you watch live TV, you're actually going to see commercials now that are geared towards financial crime, and they will have those suggestions on, phishing and romance scams and what to look out for. So it's interesting that they're incorporating that to the daily lives of everybody that's, watching TV or listening to the radio or something like that.
Yeah, 100% agree. And circling back real quick to your previous question about common elements across these activities, one thing that a little bit unique too about, or not unique, but a difference between fraud and AML BSA is with fraud, you're always, for a financial institution, they're looking at the loss to the institution and they want to prevent that. A little bit different from AML. You could have a loss, but fraud with a financial institution, losses is the big thing, and it's actually on the SAR form.
Yes. That's one of the key differences. The other thing is a lot of the fraud detection methodologies that banks have used for a long time they've tried as best they can to push toward real time or near real time, whereas AML is still more of a long-term batch process again, because you're really trying to solve for a different problem. There's definitely a convergence going on, but the underlying motivation of stopping a loss versus detecting criminal activity really do drive you in somewhat different directions. So the last thing and you've touched on this somewhat, but I'd just like to hear what you have to say. In addition to the ways you've already talked about, how are some of these things identified during the investigative process as opposed to the monitoring process? Pat?
Well, one thing too, what we've seen is interesting is a lot of collaboration with law enforcement. So, as we're writing the investigations, and even certain things, from our experience at financial institutions, it could be the luck of the draw, the investigator getting, sometimes the cases are in alphabetical order by the name, depending on how each financial institution names their cases. But you could get like a Smith and a Smith or something like that. And they might just by chance see, wait a minute, this is the same fraudster committing the same against this individual. And so they start connecting the dots. And then all of a sudden, the state, local, federal agencies are reading these SAR filings, and then they actually have active investigations. So then they reach out to the financial institution and say, hey, here's what we're seeing. There's this big crime ring. Here's what they're doing. Let us know if you see it. And then if you do, can you provide additional information, such as the IP addresses, the check like the fraudulent check images, things of that nature. And I know Nikki had a great example of elder abuse that she mentioned on a previous conversation.
Yeah, we had identified. Adrianna was working with me on this with our a case that we were reviewing. We were able to identify a medical office committing fraud with elderly people by really kind of taking that information or taking their copay information and taking that and making it to payments and taking it to themselves and paying them out through the payroll system as it was, their payments for that. We were able to identify that because we had a couple different analysts working a couple different cases, and they were able to say, hey, this makes no sense. And then we were doing our reviews and quality assurance, and we identified through the quality assurance piece of our reviews, like, hey, we have a pattern here, and we raised it up to the people above us that we needed to report to. And before you knew it, it went from 5 cases of being considered a fraudulent transactions, and it ended up being hundreds of customers, because the more we dove down and they went back and they looked for certain patterns within transaction to see, like, do we have other clients that are having these type of payments? And it turned into a really large fraud ring that we were able to identify. But if we didn't have certain levels of things put in place, like with the quality research insurance piece or quality review piece of that, where they see multiple different cases from multiple different analysts, we might not have been able to identify that ring. But it was actually, it was really eye-opening to how quickly something can balloon just out of a couple cases.
Right. Some of those patterns, they are geographic, IP addresses, a common name. It's just something that you could easily overlook. But as you go down that rabbit hole, you are making those little connections here and there. And like Nikki said, you have to escalate that. And, maybe someone doing a similar case had these same patterns and we're like, hey, wait a minute, this looks familiar. And it's really wild how we uncovered those fraud rings through that investigative process.
And one thing too, once you identify some of those patterns, and it's good to really identify what's happening in each particular case, because I know you can fine tune your modeling or create new alerts to identify those specific aspects so that you identify certain things that, if you're looking at whatever type of fraud, and then you could get into human trafficking, all these other side things that you can identify. So building those alert scenarios. And then what's interesting about fraud too, and this is sort of off topic, but when you're talking about AML and BSA and fraud, a lot of times, sometimes they're commingled. One might be doing fraud to money launder or vice versa or something. And then which department at your financial institution takes the SAR, or there two SAR filings, one on each department. So that's a different conversation, but another aspect that could be uncovered through the investigative process.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. This has been a great conversation. Your insights were really helpful, and I think there's a lot for our listeners, our audience to take away from this. We're going to have additional conversations about payment fraud, and I'm looking forward to those. So again, thank you, and we'll talk to you in our next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.